Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this week's video, I will be reviewing Vinci Watercolors, specifically the Earth-Friendly palette curated by Denise Soden from InLiquid Color. I did add a few additional colors that I thought were interesting and that I tend to gravitate towards in my own work. If you are curious about any of the materials that I use in this video or want links to any of the products I mentioned, please check the description box down below. Also, if you would like to see an in-depth tutorial of the demo painting, you can find that on my Patreon page, also linked down below. There you will find the initial sketch, project notes and materials, a full-length narrated video tutorial, and my tips, tricks, and color mixes to complete the project. I will also have the full scans of these colors available for you to view. I'm sure if you are here, you are already familiar with this palette, but for those of you who aren't, this is a curated, earth-friendly selection of pigments. I purchased the Fill Your Own set, so my review will also include some of my experiences with panning these paints. To get started, we're going to go over the color swatches. I like to keep my palette in rainbow order, starting with pinks and reds. This means that I have arranged my palette in a way that is not traditional and different from what is advertised. I will share the swatch sheet of my palette so that you can see my own palette color story, as I find seeing alternative setups to sets to be helpful when making purchasing decisions. To start, we have Red Rose Deep Quinacridone. This is a beautiful pink color with a great range. It's a very neutral pink on my cotton papers, but on some of my swatching papers I found it leaning ever so slightly cool. It would be a really great choice for a trio palette. Alizarin Crimson Quinacridone. I really love this color. It could be because I'm already partial to quinacridone colors to begin with, but I think it's a much more beautiful alizarin crimson than I'm used to seeing and working with. It's a very deep red, not as cool as some other alizarin crimsons I've seen. It also doesn't have that slightly milky look that some others I've worked with have had, indicating that it's much more transparent than others as well. Perylene Maroon is a favorite color of mine in any brand. It's such a great mixing color for achieving depth and a must-have on any palette of mine. I was immediately smitten with this color, and it has rapidly become one of my favorite Perylene Maroons. It's warmer and a bit more of a true maroon color than some others I've tried. It does have the color shift we're used to seeing with Perylene colors, but I found this one keeps its vibrancy quite well, and after a second glaze, you have a downright stunning color. Da Vinci Red, a bright, vibrant, primary fire engine red. This color is one that doesn't really require glazing, as it can achieve its mass tone quickly and easily without a great color shift once dry. Alizarin Gold, a very deep, warm orange. It has beautiful clarity and transparency. It's a great, well-rounded, neutralizing color, and it could very easily be used for creating a wide selection of earth tones. Quinacridone Burnt Orange. Definitely a deep orange nearing brown. It would be easy to put this in with the earth tones on the palette. It's very pigmented and has a great value to it. It has a very fine granulating pattern to it, and it would make an excellent choice for a limited palette if you wanted to quickly and easily create a wide range of browns. It's also a very effective neutralizing color. Quinacridone Gold. Like most quinacridone golds, this is very deep, nearly orangey brown in its mass tone. However, I found this one to be slightly different once tinted out. Most quinacridone golds I have worked with have a dynamic range in their color, almost shifting colors entirely between their mass tone and being fully diluted. I was expecting a really luminous, deep, warm, glowy yellow, but this never really quite made that shift, staying an earthy orange once diluted. Gold Ochre. I was excited to try this color, as I do use yellow ochre a lot in my work. It does have less opacity than a traditional yellow ochre and has a more deeper, more quinacridone gold mass tone color to it. It mixes well without muddying to make beautiful earth tones and muted greens. It won't replace a traditional yellow ochre for those who really enjoy the uniquely soft, beigey, opaque color in their palette, but for others it could be a beautiful and unique warm yellow to add to their palette. Hansa Yellow Deep. This color is much deeper than I would expect for a Hansa Yellow Deep and is very similar to a Gamboge, Indian Yellow, or a Permanent Yellow Deep, but has worked really well for mixing deep oranges, muted greens, and warm browns without muddying or opaque mixes. Arylide Yellow FGL. Very similar to Hansa Yellow Light or Lemon Yellow in hue, maybe just ever so slightly warmer. I would consider it to be more of a neutral yellow. I have noticed this to be a bit more transparent than those pigments, and it has a bit more personality from mass tone to fully diluted. It's a bright, lemony, beautiful, and glowy color that would make an excellent choice for a limited color palette, even a trio palette. Green Gold. I really loved this color right away, and it was more green than other green golds that I have seen. This one has a very rich olivey green mass tone, like a rich olive oil. When fully diluted, you can see clearly that it's a beautiful green gold. This color also seems to have a small amount of granulation to it, but it doesn't take over in color mixes. This is a very fun color to mix with if you haven't already. It adds a dimension of depth and brightness to every color it comes in contact with, even when neutralizing. Denise's green. I was so excited to try this color. After all, it is the creation of Denise from InLiquid Color, known for her love of sap green. It has a really beautiful warmth to it, making it a very deep and natural green. Sap green. I was very surprised at the amount of granulation this color has, not only on its own, but how it can take over in other mixes with it, even if only used in small amounts. The granulation pattern is a bit of a standout characteristic for this color, and the color is slightly cooler than the Denise's green and also lacking the same depth. Perylene green is a game changer for those of us who want a super deep, impactful, moody green. It's technically a black pigment, which would explain its desaturated value, but it still manages to be a distinctly green and truly unique color. When used at its mass tone, it's a very dark, deep forest green that's nearing black. As it's diluted down, it has a stunning, misty forest green quality to it that begs to be a color study. This phthalo green is exactly what I expected from a PG7. It has the same value we are used to seeing and the same microgranulation that seems to come from this pigment. The phthalo turquoise is a really beautiful color. This color doesn't seem to want to flow as much as others, which is noticeable in an already low flow collection. This color is slightly cooler than other turquoise colors that I've seen, usually made up of two pigments, a PB15 and PG7, compared to this single pigment version that's PB16. This color has a very deep mass tone, but tints out nicely to a beautiful aqua or cyan color, making it a great choice for a blue and a trio palette. It's also lacking the microgranulation seen in other turquoise colors, which I happen to enjoy. Cerulean blue hue. I usually avoid colors containing a white pigment in them, but this one doesn't seem to be greatly affected by it in the few tests that I've done. It's a really beautiful sky blue color with a decent range. It's a color that plein air painters might find very helpful in their work. As it's diluted, it's a beautiful sky blue that's almost begging for clouds. Phthalo blue red shade. I love phthalo blues, especially for color mixing, and I always pick red shades, so I have several in my collection. I will say that this just isn't as warm as some of the others that I've worked with, and while I won't deny that this is a warm shade, I would definitely consider this to be a near neutral phthalo blue. Ultramarine is a very standard color pigment, so we all have a pretty good idea of what to expect. It has the granulation that we're used to seeing from a PB29 and is a beautiful standard blue. As far as ultramarines go, this one does seem a bit warmer than some, and what I really found to be a standout quality of this one is how pigmented it is. Indanthrene blue is kind of like your dark blue jean color. It has a really lovely dark warm blue, especially in its mass tone. Once diluted, you can really see how it's a bit of a desaturated blue that is beautiful for color mixing and perfect for neutralizing earth tones to a stunning gray or deep black. It doesn't tend to be a granulating color, which also helps in mixing. Da Vinci Violet, honestly, this color falls a little flat for me. I'm a huge fan of dioxazine violet in my palettes and in my work. It's a great mixing color that I use frequently and is a permanent staple in my palette. This one is not as luminous as I expected when compared to the other colors in this range, and it's also not as pigmented as others that I've worked with. It has a large color shift when drying, and it doesn't seem to reach that near black color as easily as I'm used to. Violet Iron Oxide. This is a lovely desaturated color, definitely on the violet side of a maroon color. It's a heavily granulating color that does affect mixes, but it's great for natural texture. Indian Red. I thought this color was really well done. I was really happy with this color being less opaque than some of the other PR101s that I've used. I also really loved the hue of this color. It sits so beautifully between an earth tone, a red, and a maroon. It's a less saturated color with a slightly cool undertone to what is otherwise such a warm color. Burnt Sienna. I thought this was a really beautiful and slightly more lively burnt sienna. It does have some very fine granulation to it, but I didn't find it having a massive impact on mixes. I like that it's a more saturated and luminous color than others I've worked with and can be pushed to a very dark value in its mass tone. Burnt Umber. This color is a deep, warm brown, as is common with a burnt umber. Its mass tone is very dark, but as it tints out, you can see a bit of warmth in its color. This color definitely has a heavy granulation to it that I wasn't expecting. I will say that it's much more noticeable on paper that isn't 100% cotton, and that with any paint, choosing inexpensive paper can exacerbate granulation or any other quirks. Raw Umber, definitely a beautiful sepia-like color. This color I use frequently in mixes to help achieve a really dark, near black color with minimal effort. Raw Sienna Deep. This color was another miss for me. I didn't really see how it's a raw sienna, let alone a raw sienna deep. My confusion only worsens once I compare it to the regular, but still darker, raw sienna that you'll see next. In my confusion and how else to use this color, I've been using it in place of a yellow ochre in my set. It's a very transparent color, so they differ in that regard, but it has that same soft, beautiful color that you expect to see in a yellow ochre, especially once watered down. Raw sienna is another color that I felt was a little lacking for me, and it seems to fill a weird need to have a light earth tone in my palette. I will say that this color glazes really well, and after a second glaze, it seems to take on a whole new life. I love how smooth this color is with almost no granulation at all. So I think the colors are really beautiful. They're bright, super pigmented, and I found the selection I have to be mostly transparent. There's a really nice luminosity in these paints that's really quite undeniable. They just glow. For the most part, they are minimally granulating, which I personally love, and the company does give very good information and swatches on their colors when buying online for you to choose for yourself. I also noticed many of their paints have good light fastness ratings. One thing to keep in mind is that there are some colors that may not be what you expect, so doing a bit of research before buying should be done. Most of these differences are a matter of preference, and by looking at their offerings, you can probably find a color that works best for you. I found the flow of these paints to vary, but as a whole it seems to be on the side of minimal flow. Some of them have a beautiful flow that just allows the paint to flow effortlessly in wet and wet washes, or to burst into wet paper. These colors can be a bit more challenging to get flawless gradients as the paint just wants to flow evenly across the space, but will excel in even washes. Others tend to not have much flow at all, staying a bit stagnant on the paper and creating lines from brush strokes or shelves in your gradients. Many colors lie somewhere in between with a very light flow. Having less flow can be good for beginners to learn on. It's also great for those who paint realistically and want their details to be crisp and consistent. However, it can be frustrating for those who want big bursts of paint when painting wet and wet. This is neither a pro nor a con, but rather for making informed decisions when buying. I have noticed these paints tend to cauliflower a little, but it can be combated with patience. In my opinion, the cauliflowering of these paints is soft, interesting, and flowy. These don't tend to have any issues with creating the hard, shiny pigment lines of some brands. Glazing is probably a highlight for me in this brand. While these colors are certainly pretty, they seem to really come to life in glazing. From the moment you start to apply the second glaze, they just start to become so luminous that they're almost glowing. I found most of these to glaze really well without lifting or muddying the colors underneath. As far as granulation goes, the colors that you would expect to granulate do, and they range from minimal to heavy. For those who use papers that aren't 100% cotton, either for your paintings or for your swatches, I did notice that for the paints that granulate heavily, they tend to form a very distinct granulation pattern that matches the paper's texture. This doesn't look very natural or pretty, however, luckily it seems to be more common on less expensive papers. For those using 100% cotton, it's not as much of an issue. One thing I've heard a lot about this brand is comments about having shiny spots with the paint, and I have to say that this isn't a problem I've had to deal with much at all. I certainly wouldn't say that I had to deal with this more than any other brand I've worked with. The shiny areas are usually from too much paint in one area, and for me, that's usually an error that happens when I swatch directly from the pan. Since this is not something that I do regularly outside of swatching, it's not something that I have to deal with, and even in my swatches, it was very minimal. If you are someone who paints directly from the pan, the biggest contributor to these dense pigment areas or shiny spots comes from the paints not drying and picking up too much paint with your brush. For drying these paints, I had mixed results with panning them, so I would caution anyone to test them before using them in a travel palette. I found that there was minimal shrinkage from these paints, not a lot of pulling away from the sides. This only happens in areas where I didn't get the paint edge to edge in my pan, and I had no issues with any of these paints flaking off even in the mixing areas or chunks coming loose in my palette. Some of the colors dried really well and were hard to the touch, but were still very easy to re-wet. However, there are several colors that are not drying at all beyond the very top layer of skin that forms on the paint. I had allowed these paints to dry in an open palette that went completely unused in a well-ventilated area for over 2 weeks. I should also note that I live in an area that is really quite dry as well, and I was never able to successfully get some of these colors to dry. They were able to develop a really thin skin on top that feels plasticky to the touch in a concave shape, and the paint is still very fluid underneath. Once painting, you very quickly encounter this fresh paint, and it can be difficult to not grab too much paint, often leading to undiluted paint in your bristles, heavily pigmented areas in your painting, or shiny spots, and of course, waste. I ultimately decided to use the main palette after 2.5 weeks. However, I am allowing the travel palette to cure longer, and currently there are no signs of it drying any further, but I will update if this changes. If you are curious about using any of these paints for a travel palette, I would first think of your environment, use, and palette setup. If you live in a warmer area, I'm not sure that these paints will dry properly for you. If you are traveling and use a palette with paint stored on both sides, I would caution against it. Lastly, if you work with a lot of water and often have very wet palette by the end of a painting session, there's a very good chance that you're going to have a very messy palette to transport, as some of the colors will act like freshly poured pans. I would caution anyone to get to know how these paints will act for you in your environment and decide for yourself. One thing you could do, however, is bring tubes and use the fresh paint in small dollops on a very small palette or mixing surface. This would minimize the amount of paint that you would have to worry about if it needs to be wiped away or gets ruined in travel. Of course, if you work with a palette that keeps paint to one side and your travel palette remains upright or you live in a cooler, drier climate, you could have better luck with these paints not making too much of a mess during travel. Lastly, I wanted to talk about the price of these paints, as I thought that they were a really economical brand. I love that they have many purchasing options to fit various types of artists and budgets. They have tubes available in 3 sizes: 8ml, which is their smallest, made for testing new colors, travel, or beginner artists to test out. Next, they have their 15ml tube size, which is a standard tube size for many brands. And finally, they have their massive 37ml tubes. These large tubes are great for those who paint a lot, perhaps those who teach or do workshops, those who would be panning colors to share with others, or even just people who are usually working in large scale. As a note, at the time of this review, they do not have all of their colors available in their 8ml size. However, they do have a very good selection available now. If you are looking at their website and don't see a color that you were looking for, try looking in their other tube sizes to find it. Last but not least, they have their sets of watercolor. They have their curated 3-tube mixing sets, smaller pan sets, larger pan sets, and tube refill sets in various sizes or themes. As for pricing, these paints are priced very fairly. Their 8ml tubes are of course the least expensive way to try out their brand, and the 15ml scales up accordingly. However, the really shocking part is how affordable their 37ml tubes are, and they are not as expensive as you might think. These tubes can be purchased at around $17 to $24, about the same as you can get a 15ml tube from some other companies. I don't have the normal retail price in front of me, but the 37ml tubes I purchased was during their 60% off sale, and I was able to get many of these for only $8 to $16. Ultimately, I think this is a really great, inexpensive, professional brand to try out. They have over 110 colors in their line in multiple sizes and offerings to check out based on your needs or budget. My initial thoughts are that these would be better for a studio palette rather than a travel palette, but they clearly have all artists in mind. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, if you're curious about any of the materials that I have reviewed in this video, you can check the description box down below. I have them all linked, and I also have an affiliate link for DaVinci for you to click on as well. Keep in mind that this affiliate link isn't something that the company sent me or that I asked them for. It was something that I was able to just click on and ask for on their website, and that I have no other affiliation with the company other than that. If you like this video, I would love it if you gave it a thumbs up or a comment down below. If you tried these paints, I would love to know your thoughts on them, or if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'll try to get back to you, or perhaps anyone else that has tried these paints can answer your question as well. And also, if you would like to see a full tutorial of the demo painting in this video, you can check out the link below in the description box for my Patreon channel, and there I will have the full tutorial for you for the $10 tier. I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it to be helpful, and I hope all of you are having a wonderful day, and I will see you next week. Bye!